What role will transatlantic cooperation play in the development of clean energy technologies? How does energy security, long-time political relationships, how are these things going to affect the way we design markets for clean energy technology, in particular hydrogen? To dig into these questions, I'm joined today by Michel Heijdra, who's the Vice Minister for Energy and Climate in the Netherlands, visiting Washington for the World Hydrogen Congress, America's edition. Michel, welcome to CSIS.
Thank you very much.
I'm very pleased you're here today. I know that you've been at this conference for the last day and a half. I'd love to start just with your impression of where the conversation is and what your message has been here in Washington.
Oh. No, it's been a wonderful conference, and there were some people at the beginning of the conference that were being asked, how long are you working in hydrogen? And there were people that were actually already working in hydrogen for 20 years. And now this is like the moment where hydrogen from a dream becomes a reality. You see so much excitement, so much commercial opportunities that people see. But it's all driven in the background by the IRA subsidies. Everybody is talking about IRA subsidies, and there's a strong focus on mobility, and that's and a little bit also on exports. And that's a bit different from the European conversation, where there are other sectors where hydrogen plays a key role. And I think the role of exports is also stronger present in the European discussion. So it's good to see how on both sides of the Atlantic there's a lot of enthusiasm about hydrogen, but also for in different manners.
Well, I think one of the things that we've looked at over the last year and a half, and after the passage of the IRA, and also the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, which preceded it, is there's this kind of question that's in the ether: is hydrogen having a moment? Is this a bubble? I'd love your views on how the global industry is evolving and what the outlook is there, but also, how is the Netherlands looking at developing a clean hydrogen industry over the next few years?
Oh. No, I think, so let me start on the global view, and I think there's more or less consensus at the IPCC in many capitals at the European Union that hydrogen will have a big role to play in the energy system of the 2050s. If you're serious about climate change and having to go to a decarbonized economy, there is a strong role for hydrogen because it's the only one of the few energy sources that can be stored for a long time. It can bring you to high temperatures, which is crucial for the industry. So there is this role, and there's consensus about it. Where there's not consensus is how big a role it will be. Will it be 15 or will it be 40% of the total energy consumption in the 2050s? That's still being debated. In the Netherlands, what we are doing is taking a whole-of-system approach. We had an energy system, and it's the same in Northwestern Europe, which was strongly based on gas. And molecules are an efficient way of transporting energy, and we want to transform that system to hydrogen. So we see a big role for hydrogen, but it requires that we go through the whole system, the whole value chain, and do targeted interventions along the whole value chain from import, wind at sea, to the end user. And if you don't take this integrated approach, the hydrogen economy might not flourish.
So I see, we were talking just before the event that you started this position in February of 2021, just 10 days before the invasion of Ukraine. And at this point, a lot of people in Washington are familiar with the challenges that Europe has experienced with respect to energy security. How do you think energy security factors into European planning with respect to hydrogen?
Oh. No, it is one of the big drivers behind the transformation to a hydrogen economy. I think Europe has been naive, clearly naive. Energy security was not a real issue. Not many people talked about it, but we've all been awakened by the aggression of Russia against the Ukraine 10 days after I started, and energy security became something at the forefront again. And so we're grateful for the Transatlantic cooperation, the speed at which we were able to to scale up LNG transports to Europe. Otherwise, last year's winter would have been terrible. But this is only a first step. The momentum that we've seen for importing LNG is now also a step towards having a hydrogen economy where Europe will never be able to produce all the hydrogen itself. There's simply not enough space, and the population density is too high. So that means you have to import it. But if you want to import it, learn the lessons from the past. Don't be dependent on any single country or a bunch of countries. Let's make this a global system where you can import it from 20 different countries, for instance. That is the vision that I see widely shared in Europe.
So, and here the Netherlands plays a very specific role, right? The port of Rotterdam is the largest energy port in Europe. It's an essential piece of infrastructure for like much of Northern Europe. And it's going to be one of the first places that hosts green hydrogen or green ammonia, I think, import terminals. What is the, how, you mentioned this sort of like we need to look at the whole value stack. Can you walk us through how that facility, I think it's called the ACE facility or ACE, comes online in 2026? How can you walk us through like where does the hydrogen go and how do we start developing a market if Europe needs to be a really big importer, say 10 years down the line?
Yep. No, that's a very good question.
That's the challenging question, right?
Indeed, this is what keeps our experts busy every day. And I think it's good to realize that there are two essential elements in the background that are working in favor of the hydrogen agenda in Europe. The first is ETS, so it's a carbon pricing. Ultimately, in 2040, the electricity sector and the industry will not have any rights to emit carbon anymore, which means that carbon prices will go to infinity, and then hydrogen is always cheaper. So that is in the background. And the second element in the background is a takeoff obligation on certain sectors of the economy. So in mobility, there's the obligation to have a certain amounts of hydrogen by 2030 into the system. It's the same for industry, and the same for fertilizers. So those kind of obligations help to get the system started. But this is on the demand side. Then if we go through, we just don't want to have exports only. We want to have domestic production because then you can see and set a right price. Importing energy is usually more expensive than producing it yourself. So we're developing two chains. The first value chain is wind at sea. We have a very large North Sea shared with our UK colleagues, and we're putting a lot of wind parks there. Then, and what we do is we subsidize the connection points. We auction off the wind farm fields. Commercial parties can can build it. We get a lot of money for the plots, but we build, like at sea, a platform to which they can connect. And it's different. You see elsewhere in the world that people are just auctioning off fields, but not providing the connection to the grid. And for us, that has been essential in the planning.
Right.
Then we bring on shore the energy and auction off plots for electrolyzers to do that domestically.
Yep.
And the electrolyzers are connected to transport infrastructure. Those are old gas pipelines that we reconfigure for hydrogen. And we do it also with a small public subsidy. Import terminals are then connected to this same network. We do that nationwide. So in a sense, we have hydrogen hubs in Groningen, in the port of Rotterdam, in the port of Amsterdam. We all connect them through a single pipeline to have a nationwide pipeline. And we connect that with Germany and Belgium. But this is only part of the infrastructure because the summer, winter storage is different. We build salt caverns, or we auction off salt caverns and connect them to the grid so hydrogen can be stored. And finally, it's the end users. We have to look, what are the end users? So in our case, we believe it's industry, mobility, and electricity power plants. So the industry, we make plans with them and partly subsidize their switch to hydrogen. Similarly, in mobility, we subsidize vehicles based on hydrogen and hydrogen stations in the country. And finally, electricity power plants that are gas-fired have to be reconfigured, and we pay part of the transformation cost. So that is the whole value chain from production or imports to the end user at the background of the European carbon pricing and takeoff obligations. And still we have sometimes problems that the parties really use the hydrogen that we produce.
You mean, and when you say parties really use the hydrogen you produce, I mean, this is the challenge that I think faces a lot of our own government's hydrogen goals, or goals around hydrogen. It's that you need to find buyers, right? There's just this sort of massive uncertainty about how big the market is going to be. There's a lot of uncertainty about how expensive clean hydrogen will be. And so, like, incentivizing buyers has become a key challenge that our government is looking at. I think inspired by some European models, for instance, the H2 Global clearinghouse in Germany. The U.S. is investigating through the Department of Energy sort of an institution that would be a bit of a market maker, right? It could use subsidies to help buyers to offtake clean hydrogen out of our own hydrogen hubs. What do you think are the right policy levers if the ETS provides this long-term incentive, but might not offer enough short-term incentive? What can the U.S. learn from the Netherlands or from the EU in this regard?
No, you're absolutely right. The ETS is working on the long run. The incentive in the short run is not necessarily there, and also the takeoff obligations. They are there, but what if you do? If a party doesn't fulfill the requirements, it requires a whole system that's still not there to realize the takeoff obligation. But on pricing, you mentioned the German clearinghouse H2 Global, and we consider that a perfect example where there's basically a price outcome. In the US, the IRA means a fixed subsidy for amount of hydrogen. But what it doesn't do is ensure that this is like an affordable price for hydrogen at which the industry, it's an offer you can't refuse. It's not that. So how the model works in Germany, and we are joining H2 Global because we found it a good model, is it bridges the price between green and gray hydrogen, which means you're almost stupid if you're not willing to take the green product because the price difference is breached. So not a fixed subsidy, but depending on what the market does for green ammonia or green hydrogen, you subsidize the price differential with gray. That is a model that could work. It's quite expensive, but to kickstart the market, this is really needed.
So, you mentioned earlier the sort of the differing views on hydrogen on either side of the Atlantic, right? Like Europe is going to have to be probably a net importer. The U.S., I don't think we know yet whether we'll produce a lot for our own consumption, whether there's going to be an export market that develops. We have seen contracts signed to bring clean hydrogen to Europe as part of the transition or in addition to the LNG that currently ships. How should the U.S. look at Europe as a hydrogen buyer? Either our firms or our government, right? So H2 Global is a great example because it can set all sorts of standards, right? Clean hydrogen is hydrogen that comes in at less than 2 kilograms per CO2 per kilogram of hydrogen. It needs to come in with certain safety standards. What are the things that the U.S. and the EU need to sort of either agree on, or the EU is moving forward that our industry needs to meet to really set up a global market?
Indeed. So we don't know how big U.S. exports will be in the future. It also depends on how successful the domestic hydrogen hubs are going to be. In the short run, if there's more interconnection between the hydrogen hubs and pipeline infrastructure within the U.S., there are potentially more buyers. But in the longer run, you need also domestic consumption to be able to produce for export. So I don't see them as I see them as two sides of the same coin. The more successful the U.S. will be in developing its domestic market, the more successful it will be in becoming an export player. It's the same with LNG. Because the U.S. is so successful gas user, it can also export. And what do you need to do? And we come from very different approaches. A subsidy-based approach versus a carbon price and takeoff obligation approach. Yet we should ensure that both sides meet, that the green hydrogen that is produced in the US is allowed to be imported in the EU. And to do so, we need technical cooperation. There are certain fora that are developing an ISO standard that simply spell out what are the conditions to be recognized as renewable in Europe. So in a sense, the industry in the US knows if you produce for exports, what you have to do. And of course, there's a lot of technical work. We should do it at the G20 because it's not just transatlantic. Ideally, you want a lot of countries being exporters of hydrogen. So we should set, in the context of the G20, the innovation working groups there, global standards. And that's very important, especially measuring the CO2 intensity. That is the key component. And on top of that, you can add additional requirements like on the production method, that the local communities also benefit from the process, etc.
Right.
But beginning with the CO2 intensity.
So, beginning with the CO2 intensity, do you have Europe also has the CBAM, right? The Carbon Border Adjustment, which does apply to hydrogen. And
electrolyzers, yeah.
And so when Europe sort of already has a standard to measure the CO2 intensity, and importers are going to have to deal with it. My back of the envelope math says that the border adjustment on whatever we would consider clean hydrogen here in the US, qualifying for the tax credits under the IRA, gets a very small adjustment going into Europe compared to the subsidy that it receives here.
Yeah.
But I'd be interested in your thoughts on how you see the CBAM affecting how standards are set internationally.
Yeah. No, the CBAM is starting in 2025 as a monitoring device. So there we will see what the effects are in the real world. It's hard to predict when you just look at a paper how it is going to affect global trade.
Right.
But we think, because the CBAM applies to many categories, steel, fertilizers, others, cement, the really hard to abate sectors, that the countries that are affected most are probably India, Brazil, and US industries are not so much affected. Specifically on hydrogen, I think you are fully right. I mean, the standards are such that maybe there's a small levy, but it shouldn't be to the detriment of the development of the market, as far as we see now.
Yeah, I don't think so either. But I think it'll be interesting to see the two sort of co-evolve, right?
Yep.
One of the critiques that we saw after the IRA passed, especially from European colleagues, this was sort of an American-first climate policy, right? It sort of has domestic content requirements across a variety of the technologies it's supporting. It in a very kind of controlled way allows for the benefits of the IRA to spread to international markets, mostly through free trade agreements. I don't think that it's going to incentivize Europe and the US to set up a free trade agreement. So I'm wondering how you see that conversation evolving, especially with respect to hydrogen, where it does feel like the US and Europe really can collaborate on developing a marketplace and sort of that's mutually beneficial.
Yep.
But sort of how do you see European firms responding, and how do you see either the government in the Netherlands or more broadly in Europe looking to cooperation in this context as opposed to antagonism?
Yeah. No, it's a good question, and there are many ways to answer it. I think that the first response in Europe has been, we had all the projects close to FID. Now they look at the US, the subsidy is more generous, and they're developing it in the US. Ultimately, I think we will see projects on both sides of the Atlantic because there's such a large need for renewable projects, and I'm not so much afraid of that. Then there's the angle that you mentioned, is this an America First approach or not? And then I think the European Union and this administration are still talking, and I hope in January when there's the new EU-US Council, we'll find agreement here, and we need OECD partners. We need to continue to have trade, and I think that's for the best of both of us. And because there's no American value chain for all the parts of electrolyzers, so there has to be cooperation. There are large German companies, some Dutch companies as well, that make elements that are not yet produced in the US. So I think all in all, I look very favorable at IRA, because it means that the US is also taking part of the innovation curve. This is this curve that we have to go through, and both sides of the Atlantic are paying to make hydrogen a cost-effective policy, and that is the most important thing. Ultimately, what you see is this also points, and this is where there's stronger cooperation needed, to the security of our critical supply chains. Neither the US nor Europe can develop their own clean tech energy all by themselves. But we're so dependent on certain countries in the world, and we need to deal with that. It's a Critical Minerals Act, but it's also about broader economic security.
Yeah, and also, I mean, it's about supply chains, right?
Exactly,
I think like the critical minerals conversation is really interesting because it feels familiar, right, with respect to oil or gas. But now what we really need to think about is like, where are the electrolyzers going to be made? Right? Is that a place where the US and the EU can collaborate to reduce costs, to find efficiencies? And my personal feeling is that it's presently unsettled. Right? Everybody wants to be part of these supply chains. Everybody wants to be part of this transition. And we don't yet know the right balance between efficiency, cooperation, and sort of attempts to build a political economy that supports faster decarbonization, if that's not too broad a question.
No, that's right. And everybody wants part of the supply chain, but not every country wants all parts, because there are also still dirty parts within the supply chain. I mean, mining is, of course, well known. It's simply difficult in OECD countries to get new mining licenses. But it's not just mining. Even if we would have abundant lithium, say, for the batteries, to make the crucial component in a battery, you need lithium oxide through a refinery process. And that refinery process, there are hardly any plants in developed countries that do this. So it'll require a lot. And even if you have that part of the batteries, we still know that to make a real good battery, you need, or when you need to make a good electrolyzer, you need a good anode, you need a good cathode. We don't have those technologies. So it's not just the minerals, it's technology, and making it at a price that is affordable to the world, because currently European solar panels are much more expensive than those from China.
Do you see the U.S. is on, does seem to have some political consensus around diversifying the supply chain, making it more resilient. All these things are a little bit code for pulling supply chains out of China, just given the market concentration right now. What's the European view on this? And the reason I ask is we've been talking about hydrogen, and supply chains for hydrogen are not set up yet. This one we sort of get to build. You don't have to compete against lower cost things elsewhere. Countries can choose different strategies for high efficiency, more expensive electrolyzers versus less efficient, less expensive ones. It'd be really interesting in your thoughts on like where the European temperature is on those kinds of questions.
So I'm not completely sure whether we can build this value chain from scratch, because there are parts in the value chain like wind turbines. If you want to have clean hydrogen, you need clean energy, so it fits in already an existing supply chain of wind turbines, which are unfortunately the technology is concentrated in a few jurisdictions. But if we were able indeed to build this from scratch, I think Europe is coming more and more to the same view as the US. I mean, the word that is now dominant in European discussions is not decoupling, but de-risking. And de-risking means having diversified supply chains around the world, ideally in OECD countries. But if it's not OECD countries, at least as many other countries and partners in the world. So that is a key goal, but it's hard to achieve because how are you going to do that? We don't have, as policymakers, tools to enforce that. Sometimes you see in LNG terminals, for instance, the Spanish government requires that there's no single source from which the LNG comes. So it has to come from different jurisdictions. Can you do the same thing with hydrogen? Is that enough? Can those rules not easily be evaded? Should you build own supplies of materials as government? The role of the government versus economic actors is so different that we probably have to rethink a lot before we can realize this approach of more strategic autonomy.
Interesting. Yeah, these kinds of questions are just like we're going to have to muddle through them. Is like the English word I would choose, right? It's like we don't like here. Theory doesn't exactly apply in the way you want it to. So you're here in the States. You're a keen observer of what's going on this side of the Atlantic with respect to implementation of the IRA tax credits, with respect to the hydrogen hubs programs. Sort of give me the external view. What should we be watching for over the next 6 months to a couple years to build toward what are the guideposts to like really succeeding in developing a transatlantic market for clean hydrogen and seizing the opportunity to find innovation together?
So I think, and these are big questions, what you really need also in the US to see is FIDs on projects. You need to see convergence on the hydrogen carrier. It seems to be ammonia, not methanol. That will start it. What we will have to see is FIDs taken by parties that are active on both sides of the Atlantic to see that ultimately we're not only talking, but there's money made. We should carefully follow the infrastructure. We so often see delays in infrastructure. So if the import terminals are not ready, or the export terminals on both sides of the Atlantic, the trade will not happen. Sometimes the licensing and environmental licenses in the US are also fairly complex. So in Europe, we have now standards that say climate objectives or energy objectives are an overriding concern, which means, of course, you have to take environmental issues into account. But in principle, energy projects should be able to get a license. These kind of approaches are probably also needed on this side of the Atlantic to be really quick in building up the necessary infrastructure.
That's really interesting. I mean, so for the next year and a half, what should we watch from the Netherlands?
On our side, see that we complete the backbone, so see that we have the infrastructure available, see how we are also learning from the US approach on demand side subsidies. So there's a clear use of the hydrogen. We not only produce it and then, what should we do with it? But it's actually consumed. So those are a few of the key developments I would see, and of course the first import terminals. And we hope to have a big event, and when the first shipment arrives, and we bring it into even locally into the system. So those will be like real milestones in the process towards a hydrogen economy.
Excellent. I really look forward to seeing those. For my part, I'm watching. How do we come to agreement on what emissions intensity should look like? How is it going to be priced in markets that get set up?
Pricing is key.
Yeah, and then secondly, I think the watching how Europe really makes sure that hydrogen is going to the end uses that we need long term, but also is sort of permissive to who can buy it now. So refineries, industry, you mentioned electric power. Here in the U.S., we don't have as coordinated a view, and I think I'm really watching to see what happens in Europe for inspiration in that front. Michel, we've exhausted time. There's so much to talk about. I'd love to welcome you back to CSIS the next time you're in Washington, but thank you so much for coming today.
Oh, thank you, Joseph. Been a real pleasure, and thank you for the invitation.
Brilliant. Thank you, colleagues, and this is Joseph Majkut signing off.